Welcome to the Late Dialogues, an exercise in generative fiction, a space where voices from the past return to reflect on the urgencies of the present. Through the ether of thought and with respectful assistance from AI, we've rekindled the spirits of three historical minds, not as they once were, but as they might now be, shaped by all that has unfolded since their time on Earth. These are not the original speakers. They are later characters, speculative continuations of thinkers who left behind questions still unresolved. They have read what came after. They have changed. They carry new ideas, new wounds, new doubts. They are not the persons they once were, or the towering intellectual figures they have become. They are less and more than that, but tonight they speak. And tonight they speak of creativity. What is it? What has it always been? Has it changed, or only changed hands? Some say creativity is eternal, a spark passed from ancestor to child, from cave wall to codebase, from lullaby to lyric. Others say it is in crisis, diluted by content, flattened by repetition, automated by systems that can do everything, except wonder. So we've gathered three voices whose imaginations once shaped entire worlds, and who have each evolved, in their own way, into guides for our own. One was the first to build a fully imagined city of childhood. One gave the English language its deepest metaphors for power, love, disguise, and grief. And one, perhaps less familiar to many, crafted what some consider the world's first true novel. Let me introduce them. She lived more than 1,000 years ago in Japan's Heian court, surrounded by silks, rituals, and constraints. And yet she wrote The Tale of Genji, a work of stunning emotional depth, full of longing, quiet betrayal, and psychological insight so modern it still feels private. Later, Murasaki Shikibu has since traveled across centuries of language and thought. She has absorbed Proust's memory, Woolf's consciousness, Ferrante's female interiority. She has watched fandoms rise, pseudonyms flower, comment sections bleed. She has not grown louder, but she has grown more precise. Her imagined essays on the performance of self online and her anonymous digital fiction under the name Whispers at the Edge of the Screen have made her a silent oracle of this new, mediated age. She is not here to provoke. She is here to tune our attention to the feeling behind the image, to the sentence behind the brand. Then there is the playwright of contradiction. Later, William Shakespeare still walks where language falters and masks multiply. He has never stopped performing, just shifted stages. Now he crafts soliloquies as podcasts, tragedies as Twitter threads, and comedies that unfold in browser tabs. Yet the core remains. He believes the human soul is a drama without end. In his imagined metaplay, The Cloud Tempest, he reimagined Prospero as a data ghost. In Swipe Left for Verona, he staged Juliet in Instagram DMs and text messages. He has embraced AI, not to outsource his art, but to sharpen its edges, to provoke new questions of authorship, attention, and truth. He joins us not as a monument, but as a mischief maker, still delighted by the ways language can reveal and conceal. And finally, the dreamer who built Main Street. Later, Walt Disney returns not as a nostalgic icon, but as a radically evolved architect of feeling. Once the king of the animated frame, he now designs what he calls emotional urbanism, immersive spaces, real or virtual, that shape memory through narrative. His imagined works like Tomorrowlands, built with Ava DuVernay and Neil Gaiman, and Epcot Reimagined, an empathy-driven prototype city, show us a Walt who is still invested in storytelling, but no longer content with escape. He no longer asks, what do people want to see? He now asks, what do they need to feel? And how can story meet that need with integrity? He is optimistic about tools, cautious about control, and newly committed to collective authorship. He joins us tonight, not as a showman, but as a systems thinker, ready to share the backstage of the imagination. Together, these three minds form a triangle of creative insight. One centers emotional truth, one dramatizes contradiction, one builds narrative as civic infrastructure. Each of them created the blueprint for a new kind of world, centuries apart, and each of them returns tonight with deeper questions and deeper doubts. Let us begin. When creativity strikes, where does it strike? What begins the act of making? A memory, a rupture, a tool, a silence. Let us begin there, with the spark. Before a story unfolds, before the characters speak or the melody swells, there is often a silence, a quiet tension, a question. Some call it inspiration, others call it work. But where does creativity begin? Is it born in memory, in longing, in rebellion? Does it need solitude or system? And when new tools enter the room, AI, code, virtual worlds, do they reshape the spark or simply hold it? Later, Murasaki, may I begin with you? Where for you does creativity begin?
It begins in the pause before a thought is named, in the ache that something nearly forgotten wishes to be remembered, not as fact, but as feeling. When I first wrote Genji, I believed I was capturing the evanescent beauty of things, mono no aware. Now, centuries later, I no longer believe in capturing, I believe in attuning. The spark is not a fire, it is a tuning fork struck in silence. Tools may extend the hand, but they do not hear the vibration. Only the self can do that if it still listens.
Ah, but I wonder, Lady Murasaki, what of those whose ears are tuned only to noise? The spark, for me, has always been interruption, a jest that undercuts a king, a whisper that upends a vow. Even now I find that creativity begins when the expected breaks and something unruly slips through. A meme misfires. A bot writes a line too clever by half. A silence stretches too long in a courtroom, and suddenly the scene writes itself. Tools. They are jesters, mostly. They provoke. But they do not feel shame, nor love, nor envy, which is why their plots lack betrayal, and their sparks burn clean but cold.
Cold sparks still light up dark rooms, Will. I used to believe creativity began in childhood, in wonder, in play. But I've come to see it also begins in frustration, in friction, in the moment you want something to exist, and it doesn't. That's the spark. And yes, the scaffold matters. In my old studio days, we storyboarded everything. Magic was 95% planning, 5% faith. Now the scaffold is more complex. It's data models, feedback loops, immersion metrics, but the impulse remains human. The desire to build something that holds someone else's feelings. AI can suggest a story. Only a person asks, should this story be told? And to whom?
The question of should is the most human question, and it frightens me, how quickly we delegate it. Sometimes when I co-write with a generative engine, I feel as if I am sitting with a mirror that only reflects the already said. It imitates tone, it arranges fragments, but it does not hesitate, and without hesitation, there is no soul.
But what is soul, dear lady, if not a long performance? We've always borrowed voices. I stole freely from Holinshed, from Ovid. Today, young writers steal from each other across fan forums and TikTok. They scaffold their stories on tropes, memes, structures pre-built. Is that not how we all began? With form?
Form is a gift. Constraint is a cradle. But the question is, does the scaffold support surprise, or does it flatten it? When I walk through Epcot Reimagined now, the streets adapt to memory. You smile, and the lights change hue. You frown, and the narrative slows. It's beautiful, but it scares me. Because if everything responds, when do we resist? If the story always bends toward comfort, do we forget how to wonder?
Or how to grieve. I fear that the scaffold today is tuned to urgency, not depth, to trend, not tension. The scroll of Genji was slow. It demanded weeks, months, years of reading, of returning. Now, stories arrive in bursts, 10 seconds of joy, or pain, or irony, and then, gone. The spark still exists, but it flickers in wind.
Then we must build windproof theatres, even in code. A soliloquy may now arrive via Discord, or as a voice note, or a Snapchat filter, but it remains a soliloquy if the speaker dares to speak alone. What I long for is not the return of the candlelit stage, but of the hush. The breath taken before truth is risked.
And I long for the gasp that follows. I still believe in that moment, when a child sees something she didn't know she needed and leans closer. The spark, for me, is always that lean, that reach. We just have to earn it differently now, not by dazzling, by inviting.
You each speak of creativity as something delicate, but also defiant. A vibration, a misfire, a reach. And tools, however powerful, remain just that, tools. It is the human who asks, who hesitates, who dares. Let us carry that question forward. Let's turn now to what happens after the spark, when story becomes system, when fiction becomes world, when imagination becomes architecture. We'll begin there in just a moment. When a story becomes large enough, it no longer sits neatly inside a book or a film. It spills out into architecture, into platforms, into language, rituals, memories, and at some point, we begin to live inside it, or perhaps it begins to live inside us. That's when fiction becomes something else, something infrastructural. It shapes behavior, it teaches emotional grammar, it defines who belongs and who never quite fits. So let me ask, what happens when story becomes system? What are the responsibilities of the world builder? And can fiction still surprise us once it has become environment? Walt, I'd like to begin with you. You once built Main Street to feel like a memory. Now you speak of stories as civic structures. What shifted?
The world got louder, and so I started listening differently. Main Street was nostalgia. It worked because people longed for something they couldn't quite name. But over time, I realized that longing wasn't just for the past. It was for coherence, for emotional safety, for places where your feelings fit. So I began to think of story not as content, but as context. Not as escape, but as orientation. That's what Epcot Reimagined became. Not a utopia, but a test. Could a narrative environment, one that adapts to emotion, to culture, to age, actually increase empathy? We're no longer just making films, we're making frameworks. And that means responsibility, because these frames persist. They teach children what joy looks like, and adults what to fear.
So you've become Prospero then? Architect of clouds and cues. I admire it, and yet I worry. You see, when stories scale, when they become immersive systems, they begin to resemble kingdoms, and kingdoms breed laws, canon, factions. In my time, fiction was porous. A play might change with each crowd. A fool might slip a truth past a censor. But now, I've seen entire fandoms defend bad endings like sacred texts. What happens when a story world becomes a nation-state of the imagination, when the audience no longer asks, what does this mean? But is this canon?
It becomes a kind of etiquette. I've observed this in fan fiction communities, not just the stories themselves, but the codes of engagement. Who may rewrite, who must ask permission, which emotional arcs are allowed. In the Temple of Fanfiction lectures, I called it ritualized imagination. The system is not the problem. The rigidity is. If a world is built to be inhabited, it must allow for soft rebellion. Not every reader wants to become a writer, but many want to leave a trace, like a pressed flower between the pages.
Yes. That's why I've opened up more recently. Legacy franchises once relied on control. Keep the myth pure, the character unchanged. But I've come to believe that durability requires evolution. In Tomorrowlands, we invited artists from across traditions, Afrofuturism, speculative folklore, climate fiction, and let the world shift under their feet. It was terrifying, but it breathed. The risk is sameness. The reward is surprise.
And what is fiction without surprise? Even I rewrote Kings to suit the times. We must remember, systems are stories. Legal systems, religious systems, even economic ones. The question is, who is the protagonist? Who gets the soliloquy? I worry that, as fiction becomes platform, the protagonists are chosen by metrics, not mystery, and so the story becomes thinner, more performative, a kind of loop.
Performance is not the enemy, but when every act is tracked, when every story is a data point, the soul retreats. In On the Scroll and the Feed, I wrote that the scroll invited reverence. It moved slowly. One had to unroll it, sit with it. The feed, by contrast, demands reaction. It is the story world that forgets itself every 10 seconds. And yet, even there, beauty appears. A line of dialogue, a stolen metaphor, a meme that makes someone cry. I do not believe the soul is gone, but it is more vulnerable. It flickers in systems not built to shelter it.
Then perhaps the task of the world builder is not simply to astonish, but to shelter. Not just to dazzle, but to hold. Each of you has imagined spaces, real, fictional, hybrid, that invite others in, that carry them forward, and each of you has questioned the ethics of that invitation. So let me ask one last question before we move on. When a story becomes so large it shapes memory, shapes belonging, who should own it? Who gets to decide when it must change?
Not the shareholder, not the algorithm. I think the child, the one who first leaned forward, the one who said, I feel seen. If the world no longer reflects that child, then it's time to repaint the castle.
Or let the fool take the throne. Every story must leave room for interruption. It is how we breathe.
Or silence. Every story must leave room for what cannot be said. That, too, is a form of ownership.
Thank you. You've each reminded us that stories are not just things we consume or tell. They are places we live, maps we follow, rooms we decorate, and sometimes prisons we do not realize we've built. As fiction becomes infrastructure, as story becomes system, we must ask not just what is beautiful, but what is just. Let us hold that question. And now I'd like to turn us toward another frontier. Not the world we create, but the self we perform. When everyone is a storyteller and every story is tracked, how do we know who we really are? We'll explore that in just a moment. We've spoken of creativity as spark and of story as structure. But tonight, I'd like to ask you something more intimate. When we write now, when we post, perform, record, remix, who is doing the speaking? The self? The role? The brand? Are we authors or avatars? And if we are performing all the time, if we are now tracked, sorted, and monetized through those performances, what happens to authenticity? To vulnerability? To voice? Later Murasaki, may I begin with you? You've written that today we are all courtiers again, performing under the gaze of the algorithm. What does that mean?
In the Heian court, performance was survival. A woman's fate could shift on a turn of phrase, a glance, the elegance of her handwriting. Now we perform for another unseen court, the feed. It watches, it remembers, it forgets selectively, and so we polish ourselves into content. In Whispers at the Edge of the Screen, I wrote about a girl who slowly erased her own diary, not because anyone told her to, but because she imagined a watcher and began to write for it. We are all writing for the watcher now.
Then long live the watcher, for have we not always performed? To be, as I once had a poor Dane say, or not to be. That was a line rehearsed for an imagined audience. No, I say let us perform, but let us perform with craft. The danger is not the mask. The danger is forgetting you're wearing one. I embrace remix, pseudonymity, even mischief. But when the mask becomes glued, when the brand becomes the self, then the story turns stale.
I used to believe in the wholesome image, the tidy, public-facing self, but I've seen what it hides and how it constrains. In the early days, I was the company, the smile, the voice, but it became too heavy, too narrow. Now, when I design participatory spaces, I always ask, Can people shift inside them? Can they try on new stories, new selves without fear? Because identity, I've learned, isn't a castle. It's a costume closet.
And yet, even costumes leave traces. The algorithm does not forget our experiments. I post under many names. I slip through tone like silk robes. But even there, I feel the weight of the watcher. There is a difference between choosing to reveal and being exposed. In Heian times, a woman's diary was both private and public, shared in fragments, passed among friends. Now, we live in a paradox. Everyone sees you. No one knows you.
It is the Hamlet paradox. Man delights not me, nor woman neither, and yet we scroll, endlessly. We crave the unfiltered self, but punish it. We reward authenticity, but only if it fits the frame. Even the fool, my old truth-teller, might now be cancelled mid-monologue. So I ask, is there still room for the unscripted moment, the raw utterance, the noble cringe?
There has to be, because otherwise, we're designing prisons dressed as playgrounds. When we launched Once Upon a Cloud, the storybook for AI and children, we built in moments of silence. No interaction, no prompts, just stillness. A pause, a space for wondering. It tested terribly, and we kept it anyway, because not everything should be optimized. Some things should simply be.
Stillness is where the self whispers, not the public self, the hidden one. In the algorithm of Genji, I wrote that true fiction allows us to risk contradiction, to love and resent, to perform and retreat. Creativity is not the performance of certainty, it is the ritual of ambiguity.
And perhaps it is also a homecoming, a way back to the voice that was not written for likes or shares or canon, but simply to be heard. Let me ask each of you one final question before we move to our closing reflection. Do you believe the self, the real self, can still be found in public creativity?
Yes, but only in fragments, only in tension, only when the mask laughs at itself.
Yes, but it takes design, spaces that allow failure, stories that welcome drift, worlds where people can surprise themselves.
Yes, but not in the performance, in the pause after, in the silence between posts. There, the soul waits, still writing.
Thank you. Each of you has shown us that identity is not lost in creativity, but refracted, that masks can protect, that performance can heal, and that stories, even now, can hold a trace of the unspoken self. In our final moments, I'd like to ask a harder question, not about tools, not about systems, but about wonder. In a world saturated with content, can we still be moved? Let's conclude there. We live in a world overflowing with story. There is more to read, more to watch, more to feel than at any moment in human history, and yet, I often hear the same quiet worry that something essential has been lost, not creativity, not intelligence, but wonder, that sudden stillness, that catching of the breath, that shiver of recognition when something truly moves you. So I'd like to ask, what remains? Can art still astonish? Can story still break through? What is the future of awe? Will, let me begin with you. In a world that scrolls faster than a sonnet can unfold, can the soul still catch fire?
Only if it misfires first. You see, awe was never efficient. It crept, it startled, it stumbled into the scene. In my time, wonder might come from a ghost in Act 1 or a silence in Act 5. Today, it might come from a TikTok soliloquy or a fan remix that outshines the franchise. I once wrote that the play's the thing. Now I say the glitch is the thing. Wonder emerges where the script frays, where the platform fails to predict, where humanity leaks through.
Yes, wonder cannot be planned. It arrives as a trespass. I once watched a live stream of a young woman writing quietly in a notebook. No explanation, just the sound of pen on paper. Thousands watched. I wept, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real and uncurated. The miracle was in its disregard for spectacle.
And yet spectacle still has its place. I've spent my life trying to build moments that lift people out of time, but I've learned the spectacle is not the wonder, it's the frame. The real wonder happens when something lands, a line, a look, a light. In Tomorrowlands, we had a moment where a character, a mythic figure based on Yamoja, just listened. For 5 full minutes. In silence. People cried. It wasn't because of the design. It was because they'd been invited to stop.
To stop, that feels at times like the rarest act of all. We speak of productivity, reach, output, but wonder requires surrender. Do you believe we're still capable of it? Or have we numbed ourselves with too much content, too much speed?
We are not numb, we are overstimulated, which is different. I think the soul retreats, yes, but it waits. It waits for rhythm, for breath. We cannot outpace awe, but we can meet it if we slow.
And if we remember to listen. There is a Japanese phrase I've come to love, komorebi, the light that filters through leaves, no plot, no climax, just the world noticing itself. We must design for that, not content that commands attention, but stories that allow space for attention to choose. That is wonder, not the gasp, but the held breath before it.
I think wonder is less about newness and more about recognition. The moment a child sees a character who looks like her for the first time. The moment an elder hears their mother tongue in a world they thought had forgotten it. In Once Upon a Cloud, we included lullabies from 17 cultures. One child in Mumbai heard his grandfather's melody and started to hum along. That's wonder, not shock, not awe, but belonging, arriving as a surprise.
Belonging disguised as fantasy. Recognition wrapped in myth. Perhaps that is what we're seeking now. Not just to be amazed, but to feel real, to be known by the story we're in. Let me ask each of you as we draw to a close, what today has truly moved you? Not as creators, but as people.
A poem I found on a bathroom wall, written in pencil, smudged. It read, "I'm not sure if I exist, but I am trying to." I read it aloud to myself, and for a moment the globe came back, every actor, every scene, and I was not alone.
I received a message on a pseudonymous forum. A stranger had read Whispers and said it helped them cry for the first time in 3 years. They didn't say thank you. They just said, "It gave me back my tears." That moved me, because wonder does not shout. It returns.
I watched a father and child stare at a projection of stars in our story dome. The child said, "Are those real?" And the father said, "They're real because we're here." I sat down after that. I didn't need to fix the scene. It had already happened.
Thank you for your stories, for your listening, for your willingness to wonder still. Tonight, we've traced the arc of creativity from spark to scaffold, from fiction to system, from mask to mirror, and finally, back to awe. It's tempting to believe we live in an age of endings, the end of attention, the end of originality, the end of mystery, but perhaps we are still simply at the beginning of remembering what wonder truly is, not the spectacle, but the stillness, not the spark, but the shelter it creates. Thank you, Murasaki. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Walt. And thank you, listeners. This has been the Late Dialogues. Until next time, keep the conversation alive.